At face value, the Asurans are not scary. Don't get me wrong, a race of nanites that can take on the human form, but stronger, faster, and more resilient than a human is definitely scary in concept. And while we do see characters in Stargate Atlantis be scared of or wary of them, they're never really portrayed with a terrifying presence.
Thanks.
A threat to be sure, but not a terrifying one. If I had to narrow down why this is, it's because of 2 points. First is that they look human. Now this is something Stargate does to a lot of their aliens, making them look human. This is for various reasons, the lore, it makes it easier for us to understand them, and, well, it makes things easier for the makeup department. But the second reason actually ties into point 2 of why the Asurans aren't really that scary. Because they look human, it's easier for us as the audience to relate to them. Humans have this thing where we like or empathize with things that look human. It's really hard for a writer to take an inhuman thing and make the audience understand it on an emotional level. On top of this, the Asurans act human in almost every way, and they have a pretty sympathetic backstory which we will get into later. As a result of all this, the Asurans, while a major threat, aren't exactly scary. Which is kind of funny since in the same franchise we have another example of a replicating robot race that is scary. The Replicators.
Evacuate the game room! Get out of there!
Okay, quick side note before I go forward. The Asurans are sometimes referred to as Replicators as well. And the thing is, there are 2 races of replicators in the Stargate universe. There's a lot of history one can go into, and it's an in-universe theory that the 2 are related. Sometimes people refer to the Asurans as the Pegasus replicators, since they're located in the Pegasus galaxy, and the replicators as the Milky Way replicators, as they're from the Milky Way galaxy. And they are terrifying. At least until they were given human forms, but that's a different video I'm doing later. In their original form, the replicators had this insect-like form, and like swarms of locusts, they would spread out and consume any technology they could find, not really caring who it affected or who was in the way. In many ways, they were similar to the Borg of Star Trek, both being this massive machine threat to the heroes of these respective franchises. I'd actually argue that they are scarier than the Borg in some ways, since they don't have a human form that we could relate to. But again, until they kind of ruin that. We'll get to it later, pick your battles. However, there is one thing the Borg can do that the Replicators can't, that being able to assimilate organic beings into their collective. Well, I mean, there was that one time in Arc of Truth, but we can put that to the side for now. The Asurans, funny enough, don't really have anything in common with the Borg, except in one way, as they can assimilate organic beings. And honestly, this one aspect of them makes them terrifying. So, some history about the Asurans. During the Lanteans' war with the Wraith, they tried to come up with some way to win the war. While they had tried to build bigger and bigger weapons, at some point they tried to build something smaller. One that would attack from the inside. They created nanites that could assimilate organic tissue, self-replicate, and designed to attack Wraith DNA. They encoded into the nanites an aggression that surpassed even the Wraiths. While a decent idea for a weapon, something happened. The nanites began to replicate and interlock, evolving at a rate that took the Lanteans by surprise. These nanites took on the most advanced form they knew, that of their creators. However, they were still programmed to have this aggression, when they begged their creators to remove, but the Lanteans refused as they still wanted a weapon. Since the nanites were also programmed not to harm their creators, there was nothing they could do but let the Lanteans continue their experiments. When the Lanteans concluded that the Asurans would not be the weapon they sought, they decided not just to destroy them, but wipe them out and erase any reference to their existence, all save for the address of the planet they were built on. But some nanites survived, and they not only managed to rebuild, but thrive on their world, going on to launch a devastating war on the Wraith sometime after the Atlanteans lost their war. The only reason the Asurans lost their war was because the Wraith created a shutdown code and deactivated the Asurans' directive to attack them. Even then, their loss just had them return to their homeworld to isolate themselves, and you could be sure the Wraith made no move to give them a reason to attack them again. So there's the short version of their history, but where do assimilating organic beings come into play? We see this in the episode The Real World of Stargate Atlantis, in which the character Elizabeth Weir is put into a coma after the Asuran Neum made physical contact with her in the previous episode. In the brief instance in which he touched her, he managed to infect her with nanites, which began replicating inside her, using her body for raw material. I want to say this again, but phrase it a little differently. The nanites consume your body and replace it with more nanites. Your muscles, bones, nervous system are consumed and replaced with nanites that will consume the rest of your body. And just to add on to this, these new nanites would have been made using organic material, which not only renders them immune to an EMP blast, but also just... well, these organic nanites are never described, but I can't help but draw up this horrifying image of a cell being broken and just reworked to look mechanical and stuff. The only real mercy in this process is that the victim is put into a coma-like state. And even then, this is only done so the victim does not fight back. With the end goal of this whole process being the creation of a new Asuran, whose new consciousness would overtake the host. Again, this whole process is just horrifying. You are essentially eaten alive and your body, your very self, is replaced with that of a machine. At least with the Borg, you can reverse the process and try and live a normal life. But once the process is complete with the Asurans, there's no going back. Sure, the process can be stopped and the nanites deactivated, but it took a lot for the expedition just to do that, and even then the nanites were reactivated to save Weir's life later, which just completed the process. Granted, Weir kept her mind, but this was not the norm of how this process was supposed to end. The average person in the Pegasus Galaxy, hell, real life, is not going to have access to the same resources Weir did. So if they were infected, odds are nothing could be done to help them. And based on a line McKay said, it's possible for the comatose patient to infect someone who touches them. So anyone attempting to help the patient, family, friends, or doctors would become infected as well. There's a whole rabbit hole we can go down with this idea. During the Second Wraith-Asuran War, the Assyrians had used a strategy of wiping out human worlds via orbital bombardment to deny the Wraith a food source. But if you think about it, they could have just as easily poisoned the well. Like, say, send an Asuran to a planet and just have them go around and make physical contact with people, shake hands, accidentally brush shoulders, just poke people. Which sounds funny until people start falling into comas. Then doctors or anyone who touches them start falling into comas as well. People are starting to panic, isolating themselves from others in fear of getting sick. But then the people who get sick start to wake up. No one dies and things seem to start to get back to normal. However, something is off with the people who wake up. They're just not quite themselves. And people are still falling into comas, but only the ones who came into contact with the sick or those who came out of it. And suddenly you realize the people who came out of the comas are not the same as those who went in. Chaos ensues and neighbor turns on neighbor, friend on friend, brother on brother. No one knows who to trust. Institutions break down, and people begin to isolate themselves even more. Not sure if the person who was turned up asking for help has become one of those things. Honestly, this sounds like the setup of a really good horror movie. Think The Thing, but with machines.
I know I'm human. And if you were all these things, then you'd just attack me right now. So some of you are still human.
Again, everything about this is just horrifying. And the only reason this isn't done more, and this is just theorized, is that it's just a last-ditch attempt at survival. But it could very easily be turned into a form of warfare if they wanted to, and based on the short story Consort, they have done so in the past during their first war with the Wraith.
The drone weapons were familiar horrors, but they weren't the worst ones the Asurans possessed. The nanites that made up their own bodies had that distinction, able to swarm like tiny parasites through the flesh of men or hive ships, consuming it like so much meat, to build more abominations like themselves. He saw it then, a tiny ripple in his sensor readings, a tiny insect of a shuttle drawing next to the hull, a parasite infested with a deadly disease. If even one Asuran made it aboard, if one nanite penetrated the flesh of the hive and began replicating itself there, they were all corpses walking.
I should note there's a slight lore conflict, since we know the nanites will target Wraith DNA aggressively, so I don't think they would assimilate Wraith or hive ships. But still, they can use it as a form of warfare. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out that the Atlantis team did encounter a nanite virus that did kill some members of the Atlantis expedition. It was programmed to kill only humans, and it wasn't clear who made it, with one theory being it was the Asurans. So if they can use nanites as this horrifying weapon, why don't they? I don't know, and to be honest, I am happy they seemingly have no desire to do so. Maybe it has something to do with their human-like nature? But imagine if this infectious nature of the Pegasus replicators was combined with the ravenous nature of the Milky Way replicators. And I will end on that note. Leave a like and subscribe, tell me your thoughts in the comments below, follow me on my social medias, and remember...
There are many cases when patients were actually able to hear others talking to them in the rooms.
And were these comas also caused by nanites invading people's bodies?
No.